Jaffrey Civic Center, everyone. This is the third presentation in a series called Stories to Share. My name is Joe Steinfield. I am the moderator of the series, which is sponsored by Beltets. And in the back, perhaps you've all met the executive director, Becca Frederickson, whose hard work is paying off. Excuse me. At the Jaffrey Civic Center. John Driscoll handles the video and the remote connection. We have close to 30 people, I understand, from all over the country here for what I expect will be a remarkable presentation by the woman standing to my right. Heather came here as a girl on family vacations spent on Thorndike Pond. And she and her husband, Vic Ames, have lived in Jaffrey year-round for about 15 years. Her career is really an interesting one. She went to Connecticut College. She and Dick were in the Peace Corps in the Philippines. She has 3 children, she and Dick, 2 biological, 1 by adoption. She obtained a master's in social work and has had an enormously varied and interesting career, largely devoted to serving related constituencies, parents and children. And today's talk will take perhaps 40 minutes. We'll have time for questions, and I'm sure you'll think of many questions that you'd like to ask Heather. And let me just say that hearing her talk about her career and her life, helping adopted children connect with their heritage, is, I suspect, going to be a unique and compelling experience for all of us. It's my pleasure. Heather Ames.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Rebecca and Sean, for putting this together. And it's just been an incredible series. I've attended the first 2, and I love the idea of sharing your stories. I think people have interesting stories, and it's wonderful to hear about how they got there. Tonight, I would like to share a bit, first about my personal experience in international adoption, and then tell you about my work with internationally adopted children. But before I do that, I'm interested to know a little bit about all of you. And I realize I have a number of people on Zoom that I can't reach, but I have a number of people right here. And I would like to know how many people know somebody who was adopted? Just about everybody, I would say. How many people know somebody who was internationally adopted? That's quite a number as well. How many people have a family member who was internationally adopted? Oh, we have a bunch of those too. Yeah, well, that's very interesting. So you have a lot of experience and know a lot about this subject. The story of my work with internationally adopted children began with the decision that my husband, Dick, and I made to adopt a child from Korea. We had thought early in our marriage that we might adopt if we had more than 2 children. It was a comfortable decision to adopt internationally. I grew up in a family that hosted exchange students from Germany and Thailand and Turkey, as well as international college students who spent many holidays with us. My father had spent much of his childhood in China, and Dick and I spent 2 years in the Peace Corps as volunteers in the Philippines. So an Asian child appealed to us. While in the Philippines, we fell in love with a baby in our local girls' orphanage. We were not in a place to adopt a child at that time, but the end of that story is that my sister and her husband, who already had 3 children, adopted this child, and she became our niece. I'll get the next slide.
Oh,
7 years later, in July of 1977, our daughter Casey joined our family at the age of 4.5 months. This is the day she arrived at Kennedy International Airport. When our daughter arrived, the only information we were given about Casey was that she was referred to the adoption agency by the Mapo Reception Center. Mapo is a district of Seoul, and so we thought probably she was born in Seoul. We wondered about the circumstances of her birth. So we wrote to the adoption agency and we asked if there was any further information. The answer was they had no information and that her birth date and her name were assigned by the agency. Later, we learned that none of this was true and that the family had left detailed information about the difficult circumstances that had led to her relinquishment. The next slide. This is what the agency wrote. The ability to deal with little or no background information regarding our children is one of the characteristics we look for in potential adoptive families. We saw that quality in you and feel confident you can deal with the problems this unknown factor in your daughter's life will bring your way, now and in the future. We urge you to focus on the future, and we know you are already doing this. These statements were a reflection of the times when the belief was very much of welcoming your child into your family and making them like you. But what about the reality that they are not just like you? We were now raising a daughter from Korea and 2 sons born to us, but how might it be different? Our daughter did not look like her family. On her 2nd birthday, she was given a little birthday card that had a picture of an Asian doll on it. And at age 2, she pointed to it and she said, Casey. She knew what she looked like. When she went off to kindergarten, another child looked at her and looked at me and said, is that your mother? Being different raises questions of belonging that can impact self-esteem and behavior. Being adopted was not better or worse, but it was different. To ignore differences, I came to believe, was not helpful to a child. I became interested in developmental patterns and how adoption impacts that development. With children who are internationally adopted, I came to understand that their birth heritage was an important part of their identity. While these children are fully American and very much like their families in many ways, they often benefit from understanding something of where they came from. It is a part of their story and can provide a grounding and stability for life. Because we adopted before the surge of international adoption, there was not a lot of support for families to understand these differences. There were few books and not much of a support network for families to share these experiences and to learn how to navigate the questions and behaviors that were common to adopted children. How do you respond when a stranger at the grocery store stops you and asks personal questions in front of your child, including, how much did she cost? How does it make your child feel when a schoolmate tells her her mother is not her real mother? What do you do when your child has an assignment to create a family tree and she wants to know if she should include the other family, but she doesn't know anything about them? Or when she has a genetics project and is told to identify similar physical characteristics between her and her family. And when asked, how do you do that? The teacher says, well, I don't really know. These are all common situations that occur, and the answers often vary depending on the age of the child. Some children want to talk about them, but some don't, and want to keep all the feelings to themselves. Often, they wish it would just all go away. Fortunately, as more and more children were being adopted from around the world, agencies began to see the need for providing both pre-adoption education and post-adoption support for families. This became my job at a large adoption agency in the Boston area that was placing children both domestically and internationally. While there's a lot to say about how different situations might be addressed, I would like to focus on my experience of traveling with adoptive families to their child's country of birth. Often, adoptees told me that their story of adoption felt as if it was about someone else until they traveled and visited their birth country. Then it became real for them. In the early years of international adoption, most children were escorted to the United States. Travel was discouraged and difficult. This had been our experience. As a result, parents had little understanding of their child's birth country. But in the 1990s, when China opened its doors to adoption because of the one-child policy, travel was required by at least one parent. I traveled with many of these groups. While intimidating for some parents, this requirement had many benefits. Families who had been assigned children from a particular orphanage generally traveled together, and they were accompanied by an agency social worker. They found that in being in a group, they found support amongst the other parents and comfort in sharing their experience. Traveling gave parents a better understanding of the origins of their child that later could be shared with their child. Often they were able to meet caretakers who had cared for their child and could help in the transition of explaining to the parents what the habits of the child were. Although the children were usually too young to remember the experience, pictures were taken while they were there. And many of the parents came home, put all of these pictures into an album, a life book for their child. And what I would hear over and over again was how children loved reading that story about how you adopted me. In many cases, these family groups stayed connected, had reunions, and the children developed lifelong connections, supporting one another as they grew up. And I'll do another slide. This is a picture of one of our China groups. And on the left is a picture taken in Guangzhou at the White Swan Hotel, which is right next to the US Embassy. And it was always difficult to put the children on this red sofa, but we did it just once for 30 seconds because we wanted a group picture. But the picture on the right is the same group of children 1 year later getting together. Before I ever traveled with adoptive groups, Dick and I took our daughter to Korea on an agency group tour in 1994. Although we had traveled fairly extensively, the idea of our daughter being with other teenage adoptees made a lot of sense. The first day or two was a little bit awkward, but then 4 girls bonded and they were off and running and having a great time together. They could share the excitement, but they could also share awkward moments. I'll do another slide. So this is a picture on the left of the 4 girls on our trip. On the right is our daughter, Casey. On the left is her friend who was actually from New Hampshire And now, 27 years later, they're still in touch with each other. These kids really had a wonderful time together, and they could share these moments when, for instance, they went to a store and the person there spoke to them in Korean. And if a child had been there by herself, she might have felt very awkward that she couldn't speak the language. But having all four of them together, they could share that experience and it wasn't so uncomfortable. Really important for them to be together. In the middle are two little 7-year-olds in Cambodia who bonded with each other, just were having a great time. And up on the right are 3 girls in Russia, just having the time of their life. As the population of internationally adopted children began to grow up and ask questions, families became interested in taking children back to visit the country of birth. The program that I worked with, the TIES program, and that's TIES, as in sort of connections. The TIES program was developed by a travel agency that saw the need and developed an understanding of adoption and hired social workers to travel with the groups. The trips were planned with the intention to acquaint families with the culture and the history of the country, and also to come to a better understanding of the reasons for adoption. So often, international adoptees told me that they felt as if their lives began when they met their adoptive families. The stories of where they were born and the circumstances did not seem real because there was no connection to the people or to the places in the first months or years of their lives. The TIES program understands the importance of helping adoptees connect with their individual stories. This is the reason that we visited orphanages and often met caretakers or foster families who had cared for them. The next slide. As children grow up, they often struggle with dual identity issues. Who am I? How do I fit in the world? They understand that they were born in another country, but did that make them Russian or Chinese or Guatemalan or Indian? Where do I belong? There was confusion between the culture that they lived in and the culture that they came from. Am I really American when others perceive me as something else that I do not feel connected to? And I heard many stories of adoptees who would be asked, do you speak English? Where do you come from? They were as American as you and me. And it was always disconcerting. Our daughter talks of when she was in high school and in the cafeteria, girls always congregated at one table or another. And most of her friends who were Caucasian or mostly Caucasian sat at one table, but there was a whole group of Asian kids who sat at another table. And she kind of had this feeling, well, it feels like maybe I ought to be there, but that's not where I'm comfortable. So that's part of the confusion that kids often felt. While there were occasionally adoptees who were eager to search for birth family connection, this was not the main purpose of our trips. I traveled with ties to many East Asian countries, as well as Russia, Romania, Kazakhstan, and India. Each country is different in their reasons for placing children overseas for adoption. And this was an opportunity to better understand the circumstances. Many people ask, what is the best age to travel to their birth country? There are really benefits to every age. And I traveled with children as young as 5 and every age up to adulthood. Children who are very young may not remember the experience entirely, but it may establish a very positive feeling and grounding that serves them well as they grow and develop. Children in pre-adolescent ages are old enough to absorb a lot about a country and their adoption that can give them a security as they enter the teenage years and are establishing their identity. Older teens and adults have a maturity that allows them to question and learn at a sophisticated level. Parents often asked, well, if my child doesn't seem interested in traveling, should I push it or not? And that was always a hard question. You know, we always wanted the child to want to go. But I also remember a story where a child really didn't want to go, but her mother was insistent that they were going to do this trip. They thought that it was good for her. And so the child didn't tell any of her friends she was going on the trip. She was ashamed. She didn't really want to do this. She just wanted this whole business of being adopted to go away. And at the end of our trip, she was out there shopping and buying gifts for all of her friends because she wanted to take these things back and tell her friends about the wonderful time and the place she had visited where she was born. So what are some of the experiences on these trips? From the moment we land in the airport and for the next 2 weeks, a child is among people that look like them for the first time often. And their parents are the ones who look different. I sometimes had parents say, oh, I can't find my child because our in-country guide was always a wonderful person who welcomed us, stayed with us throughout the trip, and she taught us a lot about the rich history, culture, and customs of a country. The next slide. We always visited historic sites, and these are just a few. In China, the Great Wall, in India, the Taj Mahal, and Angkor Wat in Cambodia, but many other incredible sites that really help to build pride in these kids of the amazing things that happened in their countries. The next slide. Often my co-leader was an adult adoptee who, having lived the adoption experience, could understand the feelings and questions that kids had. They were great role models. On the left here is a young Indian man, Ian, who was a wonderful co-leader, just full of enthusiasm. He adored the kids. He ultimately lived for several years in India. He helped to start a foster care program under the Indian government. And he just was an amazing young man who then married an Indian woman and has come back to the United States and continues to work in child welfare. The young woman on the right was a college student, adopted from China. Again, a bright, young, terrific young woman, and the kids just adored her. So it was really special to have someone who could be a role model for these kids as they were growing up. Next page. This is a picture of Ian again in Kazakhstan, and I traveled with him in Kazakhstan as well, with a whole group of kids. We had opportunities to visit schools, daycares, foster homes, and orphanages, and learn about how children in this country are educated and cared for if they do not have families. And I'm going to go through a few pictures fairly quickly just to give you a feel of some of the places we visited and what it was like. We did the next slide. This is a school visit in Cambodia. The children all came out, were lined up to greet us as we walked into the school. On the right was the classroom, and you'll see these 3 little boys sitting at one desk. A very different experience for them in school. The next one. These are a couple of school visits in Korea and India. Yeah, I don't know if you can see in Korea, we all have drums, and we're learning to play the Korean drums. On the right is a charming little Indian boy. They had all made New Year's cards for us when we came and visited. We also were able to visit a girls' boarding school in China where we performed for each other, and then the kids went to the cafeteria, had lunch together, and the end result was that many of these kids became pen pals, shared their addresses, and stayed in touch for a while. The next few pictures, if you go to the next, also are really about the orphanages that we visited. It made us very aware of how important the love of a family is. These were children in a Korean orphanage. And as you can see, sometimes they were very sad and hard to reach. Next one. This gives you a sense of how children ate and slept. There's no such thing as privacy. It was all group care. And they did the best they could. Another one. This is an orphanage in Romania. And we always took gifts that were requested by an orphanage. This particular orphanage was very eager to have art supplies. So we had brought a lot of art supplies and we spent the afternoon doing art projects with them. One more. This was really a remarkable visit in Korea with a deaf-mute boy who was in foster care. He couldn't hear, he couldn't speak, but he had incredible talent for painting. And his foster father had taught him, did I say Korea? I think I meant China. His foster father had taught him Chinese brush painting. So he painted for us. And after he finished his painting, he gave it to one of our kids to bring home. Very special. Next slide. Another type of care is with what's called SOS villages. And it's an organization that actually was based in Austria, but has operations, has villages in many, many countries around the world. And it's a concept that builds off of family care being important. So these SOS villages were a beautiful village that had 10 or 12 homes in it. And in each home, you had one mother and up to 10 or 12 children. These children became like siblings to each other. The mother devoted her life to caring for these children, and they remained attached to this home and to this family, even after they may have left to go to school or to get married, but they would come back to this village. And it was really a wonderful kind of care that these children got. The child on the left is in an SOS village in Kazakhstan. She had on the traditional dress. She played a traditional music instrument for us when we visited. The children on the right are in Cambodia, and they were out of one home that we visited that day. It's really quite a remarkable organization. And when these foster mothers get too old to care for the children, they stay in the village and they have a place to live until the end of their life. Next slide. Another thing we did was to visit clinics for the babies, well baby clinics. And this is a picture in Korea where, because most of the children were cared for by foster care, children who were going to be adopted were brought to a clinic to have their well baby checkups. So we stopped in on the day that they were coming to the clinic to visit. And it gave the kids a sense of the kind of care that they had gotten before they came overseas to be adopted. Another experience we had was to visit a birthing center where the birth mothers had given birth. And on this one occasion, we had a fairly young child, a 7-year-old child, who was bouncing around in the clinic and sitting on every chair and not really paying attention. And her mother was a little upset because this is where her birth mother had given birth to her, and she felt it was an important connection for the child, but she just wasn't paying attention at all and just bouncing around on these chairs. Well, later that night, she said to her mother, "You know what? I sat in the same chair my birth mother did." So you just never know how they're making connections. Next slide. In some of the countries, we are able to visit the placing agency where they have kept records. And sometimes we can get a little more information on these visits. On the left is the Holt Adoption Agency in Korea. And we were able to visit there, and each record that had been kept for a child was brought out. It was on such a visit that we had at Holt with our daughter, where actually we picked up a little more information. Remember I said she came, the only piece of information we had was that she came from the Mapo Reception Center, and Mapo was a district of Seoul. Well, turns out she came from the Mukpo Reception Center. There was a typo. It was not MAPO, it was MAKPO. Well, Mukpo is a port city about 5 hours away from Seoul. So it was a very different place. And even that little bit of information was a little disconcerting that it hadn't been right. And for all these years, for 17 years, we had a different idea of where she had been. The children on the right are at the China Center for Child Welfare. They too kept records, and often we would find out a little tidbit or something about where the child had been left off. Sometimes it was on a bridge where they knew that people would go by and the child would be seen very quickly. Or sometimes it was, in another place that they knew that the child could be found. One of the most important parts of the trip is when the individual families can make connections with people and places significant to their child. Many families are able to visit the orphanage where their child had lived. Sometimes caretakers still work there, or sometimes they could be located and would arrange a meeting with the family. And I want to show you several pictures along that explain some of this. If you'll do the next slide. On the left is a Cambodian boy who was meeting up with his caretaker, and he had brought an album of pictures that he was showing her, and she was delighting in seeing how he had grown up. On the right is a little Vietnamese girl, and her caretaker no longer worked at the orphanage, but she had come from a distance. They had contacted her, she had come. She wanted to see the child that she had cared for. Next one. This is a picture of a child in Kazakhstan, and the pediatrician who had cared for her was there and very eager to see her. You also see a picture of her sitting in the orphanage where the beds are, probably in one of the beds where she might have slept before she was placed. Next one. This is quite a story. This is a story of an adult adoptee, one of the rare times that someone traveled without family members because she was older. She was in her 30s. She had been born during the Vietnam War. And her mother had actually lived in Vietnam when she adopted her. And they had had a caretaker who cared for her. She was very eager to find that caretaker and to see her again. But it had been difficult. We'd been trying for months before the trip to locate the caretaker, but hadn't been able to find her. But the last week we were there, she was located. Now, mind you, we don't have GPS to find some of these people. And, This woman who had been located lived way out in a rural area. There weren't any roads there. So guess what we did? We got on motorbikes and we traveled through rice paddies and over the dikes and around, and someone knew where we were going. I sure didn't, but I hung on for dear life. And we got there. And this is the home that we visited with the elderly woman who had cared for her with her family. I think they'd been out that morning. They had done in one of the chickens in the backyard. They had fixed a wonderful stew for us. And we had a great meal there. And at the top right is the adoptee showing one of the family members' pictures of her growing up in the States. The next one. And this too is quite a touching story. This young woman was placed in this basket in India outside the orphanage gate. And they had this little indentation where there was a basket and doors on the other side that went into the orphanage. And a child could be left there. We went back to that orphanage. We saw where the child had been left, met the caretakers who had cared for her. And the remarkable thing about this story is this child was born with no legs, but she had been left off in this basket. She had been adopted by an incredible family. And I can't tell you how many incredible families we've had who have taken children who needed medical care that they might not have gotten in their country. So really a wonderful story. Korea is unique in that many children are cared for by foster parents before their adoption. The adoption agency was often able to locate the foster parents and arrange for a meeting and visit with a visiting family. And if we do the next slide. This is the picture of our daughter in 1994 when we visited Korea with her foster parents. Casey said to us after she met them that the foster mother called her by her Korean name. And it was at that moment that something clicked and it felt like, oh, I really was there. So you never know just what it is that makes that sense of connection. I think one of the things we didn't anticipate was how important it was for the foster family when we visited. They had cared for children, loved them, but Casey was the first one who had ever come back to see them. And for them to see her growing up, thriving, was really a wonderful thing for them as well. And actually, I think sometimes for the adoptees who don't remember the foster parents, it's a little more awkward. It's like, well, who is this person? But it's often a very important connecting experience for them. On the right is the social worker who did the home visits while our daughter was in foster care. She came out as well and wanted to meet this child. She no longer worked as a social worker. She had married, she had a family, but she wanted to come and meet Casey. She was a wonderful woman and we stayed in touch with her. And then some years later, when Casey went back to study in Korea, this woman was in touch with her, invited her to her home, and actually bought her a hanbok, the Korean traditional dress that Casey still has today, and her daughters will put on for fun sometimes. Our tours always exposed us to arts and culture and day-to-day life. This is China, where we had a cooking class. On the right was the dance performance that we attended. And I'll just take you through a few slides of different kinds of experiences that we had. Next one. This is on the Mekong River in Vietnam, where we went to the floating market. This was where all the farmers came down the river and brought all of their produce. And on the right, it's a little bit hard to see what it's all about, but this was the woman who was selling her pineapples. So the kids climbed aboard her boat she took off all the outside of the pineapples, made it sort of almost like a popsicle so that they could hold on to it. And the kids were all eating pineapples on the boat and having a great time. Next one. Well, there were other ways to get to market too. And I think that was just part of seeing day-to-day life. And the next one. And as well, we saw some sights that were kind of unsettling and difficult, but that was part of life. And there are struggles and difficulties, and it was important for us to acknowledge that it wasn't all beautiful and wonderful sometimes. Next slide. Our trips always ended with a relaxing and fun experience. The last couple of days, we had all kinds of experiences, but we just wanted to relax and have a good time with each other. And so these are just a few pictures. On the left is a picture of families at the top of, in one of the mountains in Mount Sorak National Park, which is in Korea. In the middle are girls going down the Li River in Guilin in China. And again, that picture shows how some of the older adoptees bonded with the little adoptees. And they just became like big sisters and role models. They had a great time together. And on the right was just a beach resort in Cambodia where we were relaxing and having a good time. One more. Our final night together was always a big celebration where we had a great dinner, and many of the kids had bought traditional dress while they were there. And so here are a couple of girls in Vietnam dressed in their traditional dress. And on the right, in India, many of the girls and the mothers had had their hands painted with the henna designs. So we often had just a great celebration before we departed the next day to return home after this incredible experience. Connection, grounding, pride are the words that come to mind when I think of the impact of a homeland tour. It often felt to me that children returned home more confident, stronger than on the day they arrived, and that this was the beginning of a process to bring their two worlds together. I would like to share what our daughter wrote in her college essay a few months after she returned from her first visit to Korea. This is what she wrote. I learned to appreciate the culture and the language, and I was able to meet my foster parents, but the most important benefit is my own self-acceptance. That new comfort in her identity led her to study the Korean language and later spend a college semester studying in Korea. Ultimately, she was able to connect with a wonderful birth family. For me, parenting an adopted child enriched our family life and broadened our understanding of the world. It has been an honor and a privilege to travel with so many families and to share in many extraordinary experiences that have built understanding and connection to birth heritage. So thank you for listening, and I'd be glad to take any questions. Peggy.
I don't know about the rest of you, I need to catch my breath. Thank you, Heather, for that wonderful talk. Sean, can we see our online participants?
Sure. I'll stop the share, and there they are. Let me know that they're, so folks, you are now on the big screen in the Civic Center.
Well, it's a pleasure to see many of the 33 people who have joined us online, including, I believe, Heather, some classmates of yours from high school or perhaps later, relatives. And the first question goes to somebody online. If you would like to just unmute and raise your hand.
I'm not sure if we're gonna be able to hear them that well. Turn this up, maybe they could put in the chat.
Can they
There was
put in
an
the
earlier
chat?
question where it said,
Question for Heather.
yeah,
Yes, take off the chat line for a moment, please. Heather, there's a question about connecting with birth parents. You've talked about bringing adoptees to their national heritage, their heritage from their countries of origin. And the question that was just raised goes back to a comment you made near the end of your talk, that Casey eventually was able to connect with her biological parents, if I understood you correctly. Can you say a word or two about that?
Sure, I'd be glad to. Our daughter's story is a very positive and wonderful story. As I mentioned, when we went to the adoption agency, we got a little more information that she had come from Mukpo. The year that she studied for a semester in Korea, at the end of that semester, her brothers and her father and I went to Korea to travel with her. And we just decided that we would go to Mukpo to see what the place was like that she was born. So we did that. And our daughter was not looking for her birth family. I think it wasn't something that she really was eager to do. And that's true of a lot of kids. They're uncertain about it. But we went there and we went to that Mukpo reception center. And that's where we found out that there was a lot of information that had not been passed on to the adoption agency. And it described the circumstances and the difficulty the family had. We went there just thinking that maybe we'd find out a little background information. Was this a single mother? Was this a young mother? Who was this? What was the situation? But in fact, we found a whole family. We found parents who were together, two older sisters who were part of the family, and she had been the baby that they could not care for. So there was a lot of information. It was a bit overwhelming, and we were quite excited, but also wasn't quite what we expected. We were told that we could go to the city hall and get an address for these people if they were still alive. So we did that. And they actually got quite excited about it and thought we should get in a taxi and go see them. But we didn't think that was such a good idea. It was really up to our daughter, but she didn't think that was a good idea. It made us kind of anxious. But we came home with that information. And actually, it wasn't long after that that our daughter decided to write to them. And she felt that if she knew about them, they should know about her. And so she wrote to them just in Korean, because she had learned Korean, just very briefly, and said she was fine and sent a picture of her family. And we didn't know what the circumstances were of the family. We didn't know if we would hear back, but indeed, a few weeks later, we got return letters, and they were absolutely thrilled. The parents had never told the older sisters that there was another sister because they weren't sure that she would ever come back. But that day they sat down and they told the sisters, and they were thrilled to know that they had another sister. So then it started a writing campaign that went back and forth for about 3 years. So our daughter took her time in thinking about going to Korea to meet them. And it happened that 3 years later, I was traveling with another group to Korea, so I was there anyway. And she said she was ready to come and meet them. So Dick and she came over at the end of my trip, and we went and met them. So they've continued to have a wonderful relationship. They're extraordinary people. We have had the sisters come and visit here. The parents have never been able to come here. But just the year before COVID, Casey took her 2 daughters and her husband back to Korea to visit with them. So they have met her children. And it's really been a very fortunate, unusually wonderful story, because it's fairly uncommon. It's a together family that is there. And it's worked out very, very well.
Well, when this series was entitled Stories to Share, I'm not sure we anticipated that story. Someone, if you'll just stand up and speak loudly so we can hear you.
Peggy, I don't have a question. I just want to thank you for that's such a moving and enlightening story. And, as you know, I've grown up, adoption was always part of my life plan. I believe in it really strongly. I never wanted to create more children, but feel strongly we should take care of the kids who are here and we get adopted eventually. And what you've done is just amazing. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Peggy, because you have a wonderful family and been a wonderful mother to children adopted from Russia.
Let's go back on the chat line, Sean.
Yeah.
And thanks for sharing, Ann and Jim Banghart. Well, you're getting a lot of plaudits here. Is there a question from anybody online? Just raise your hand, or if you prefer, go on the chat line. All right, in the room? Yes, stand up, please.
I was just wondering if the adoptive parents in this country are ever of the same ethnic origin as the children that they adopt.
Yes, occasionally they are.
Would you repeat the question?
Oh, yes. The question was, are the adopting parents ever of the same ethnic group that the adopted child is? And not very often, Cassius, but I did travel to China with a Chinese couple who was adopting from China. There were a number of couples where maybe one parent was of the same origin. But I would say the majority were Caucasian parents adopting a child from another country.
Someone else?
Just one addition to that, Cassius, one of the things that was interesting in Kazakhstan, children who were adopted from Kazakhstan, you didn't know whether they might be of a Russian heritage or an Asian heritage. And so we had a mixed group in Kazakhstan, some that looked very Russian and some that looked very Asian.
Yes. Yeah, please.
Did you get involved with this organization before or after you adopted your daughter?
The question was, did I get involved with this organization before or after we adopted our daughter? We adopted our daughter in 1977, so a long time ago. That was before I was working in adoption, and then I worked for an agency in the Boston area, Wide Horizons for Children, for quite a number of years. But then the TIES program was another program that Wide Horizons allowed me to travel with because it supported my knowledge and awareness that could then help the children that were coming through the agency. So I really was working with 2 different groups, but that was all after we had adopted our child and after we had taken her to Korea.
Who's next?
So Bob Woods at home wanted to ask
Yes,
a question. I'm not sure we'll be able to hear him, but go ahead and try, Bob, if you can unmute yourself.
Yes, sir. Can you unmute yourself? Go ahead. Can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry. I'm not sure. So maybe if there's any chance you could put your question in the chat, that would work better.
Mr. Woods, we're not hearing you yet.
Okay, I can
Oh, here
speak.
we go.
I was going to ask, Heather, whether the response from the adopted child, like Casey, to the first visit back in her homeland, whether it's typical that that person just sort of blossoms, because that's what I remember from Casey coming home from Korea. She suddenly looked very connected and a completely different person after that. And I'm wondering how often that happens with other adoptees who show up in their home country and reconnect to where they came from.
So the question is how often it happens that children feel very connected, and it's almost transformative, because that's the way it felt to us with our daughter. This happens to be my brother, the uncle,
Little brother.
who knows her very well and knows the transformation that it seemed to happen after she returned. And as I described, so many of these children, it felt like they stood taller, they were more confident. And granted, it was the beginning of a process of putting their two worlds together, but I think it happened all the time. Really was an amazing experience, and it's really the reason I came to believe that that grounding of and learning about the reality of where you came from was very important to their sense of identity and comfort with themselves.
Well, Anita Ravoi is in the upper left-hand corner, and I happen to know Anita. We're law partners, and if you would unmute yourself, I know that you're a classmate from high school, am I right?
Yeah, yes, 1 minute, I have to unmute.
We can hear you.
We can hear you. This is a chance to say hello, and
Yes.
you can tell us what Heather was like.
She's always been wonderful, and I am delighted to see so many classmates on this video, on this Zoom, because we all loved Heather then and continue to today. And she is remarkable, and Heather, you gave a fabulous talk, and the photos were extraordinary also. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart. It was wonderful.
Thanks, Anita. Question from the moderator, myself, Heather. Do you keep in touch with many of the adoptees? And have any of them, to your knowledge, made a decision to return to the country of their birth? I mean, not just to visit.
Well, as I said, the question was, am I in touch with many of the adoptees, and have many returned to their country of birth to live? As I mentioned, Ian, who I traveled with as a co-leader from India, he went back to live in India and was the one who helped to start a child welfare foster care program there. I am in touch occasionally. Just the other day, I had a Christmas card from someone, but I would say mostly I'm not in immediate touch. They've sort of gone on with their lives. There was a time where many of the families I traveled to China with who were adopting invited me to come to their reunions. There was a group here in New Hampshire that got together, and the last time I saw that group was at the Peterborough Players. They had all showed up. They were having a reunion, and so occasionally, but there were a lot of kids, and I'm not in touch with a lot of them. I am in touch with the director of the program, and of course with COVID, they haven't been running the program for the last couple of years, which is really too bad, because I think a lot of children are missing out who might have traveled, but they've had to cancel their programs.
All right, well, we have a few minutes more. Yes, sir.
So Heather, you talked about, trying to find their identities. And obviously, one of the key elements of your cultural identity is language. So, and you mentioned your daughter ended up studying Korean. Do you have a sense from all the families you've dealt with of the percentage of the foreign adopted children who end up studying their, if you will, mother tongue, their birth tongue?
It's a good question, Bob, about whether the children study the language of the country where they came from. I don't have a sense. I don't have any percentages. I don't really know. I do know that some have studied, but how much I can't really say. One of the stories that was sort of interesting to me was, and was really a learning piece for me, was talking to a family who had a child from China. And there were some opportunities for that young child to go to a sort of Chinese schooling program here in the United States. And the child was learning a little bit of language at that program. One of the things that was interesting was that that family had their other child, who was a biological child, go to school with the adopted child. Because when you send one child who's adopted off to a program, that can feel very isolating. But part of your family identity is about being part Korean or part Chinese. And so this family had the great wisdom to say their son, who was not adopted, should also learn Chinese because that was their family identity.
I see Dayton Coles is here online. Mr. Coles, are you in sunny California? And did you grow up or know our speaker when you were both younger?
Yeah, I did. Heather, maybe you can answer that. Heather and I, again, I'm another high school classmate. And yes, I'm here on the West Coast outside of San Francisco. So I think you can boast a coast-to-coast audience here tonight. That was a great talk, Heather. You did a fabulous job. And I'll just say what Anita said, which is, I assume you took most of those pictures. They were fabulous pictures as well. Nicely done.
Thank you, Dayton, very much.
Thank you, sir. And I don't mean to slight any of the other classmates who are here today, but I will say that this has been a remarkable experience for all of us, Heather. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Joe.